but if you're trying to be keto or lower your carbs, you don't want to go near these or restrict to a very small amount, if at all. Hi, Dr. Eric Westman here with another Dr. Westman Reacts. I was sent a video called The Low-Carb Fruit Fallacy from MedCram, Medical Lectures Explained. And of course, I teach a low-carb program. If you do count carbs, you would count up to 20 total carbs, not net, per day. And we do kind of make an assumption that all carbs are the same. And this video tries to point out that that's not such a great thing. So let's see what they say.
Welcome to another MedCram video. We're going to talk today about the low-carb fruit fallacy. And what is that fallacy? That fallacy states that 39 grams of sugar, for instance, in this soda, is the same and has the same effect as a similar amount of sugar in a whole fruit product. People will say, look, fructose is fructose. Sugar is sugar. It doesn't matter how it's packaged. It has the same effect because the liver's got to still deal with that sugar in the same way. And what I'm going to show you today, looking at data, is that that is just not the case.
Well, so time out. We're looking at a soda and a couple apples and 38 roughly grams of sugar. Well, to technically explain sugar, it's really sucrose. And sucrose is a disaccharide, meaning it's glucose and fructose linked together. We rarely find fructose by itself in the natural environment or even in the high fructose corn syrups. High fructose just means there's a little more fructose as a percentage than in sucrose. So actually we're talking about sucrose here. And I do make the simplification that, it's going to be about the same, the effect of apples and a soda, so avoid them, right? And so if you're under a 20 total gram per day kind of rule, then you wouldn't even have one apple. You wouldn't even have half an apple. We would teach you no apples and, of course, no sugar in the drinks. So the paradigm that I'm coming from is both of these are equally as bad, meaning it's probably going to raise the blood sugar. I mean, you can even test your own blood sugar elevations with a continuous glucose monitor to see if there's any difference between the apples and the soda. So the paradigm difference here is these are off limits, both of them. And if they have a small difference, it doesn't really matter because they're both way out of bounds in terms of a low carb sort of approach. So the other thing I need to remind you is that I'm an MD. I'm a physician in a clinic. The program has to work, so it has to be effective and it has to be simple and easy enough so that you don't get caught in the weeds and worry about things that aren't so important. So we focus on the high level view of what's important. So I would say both of these raise the blood glucose, stay away from them. And I think what we're going to hear is that it's more complicated, but at the end of the day, let's see what happens to the blood sugars.
And it's a fallacy. And it's not just a fallacy with dietary low-carb physiology. It actually is something that's much wider, and a lot of the pharmaceutical companies also fall into this situation. So what happens is usually they'll find some sort of substance in nature that has a known benefit on the human body. So there's our substance in blue there. And what will happen is that this...
There's a sidetrack here and something that has nothing to do with sugar. I don't quite understand talking about beta carotene here. I think the point is that, yes, if it's not in the same natural milieu, it may not have the same effect.
Find in 2 apples have the same effect on the human body that 39 grams of sugar in a cola can have. And so to do that, let's look at whole fruit specifically. So if you actually look very carefully at whole fruit, what you will see is that there are compartments that are set aside, like on a submarine that has compartments that can lock down certain areas. These are smaller quanta of packaged sugars that are released a short amount at a time. You can see here different species of apples that you can see.
Okay, I got it, that there's fiber in the apple and there isn't in the sugar. But what happens to the blood sugars? That's really the bottom line.
So to demonstrate that, let's take a look at, for instance, a whole apple applesauce, which is somewhat processed, and then finally apple juice, where all of those cells are basically cracked open and the glucose is free to be absorbed. So what we're looking at here is serum insulin. How much does the insulin go up? And you can see that for the whole apple and the applesauce, it's very similar. There's hardly any difference. And in both of those cases, you can see here that the cells have not been cracked open and that there is a longer period of time over which this glucose is going to be absorbed, this fructose or glucose, depending on which sugar that you're talking about. However, the apple juice, where it is liquid, where the cells have been cracked open in the apple, you can see here that there is a significantly higher amount of insulin. And why would that be? Why is there a higher amount of insulin that is secreted in that situation? Well, it's because there's a huge bolus of sugar, as you can see here on the next slide. Here again, we're looking at the apple juice, the applesauce, and the whole apple. As it goes up.
So stopping here, so that rise in insulin is what we're trying to protect against. Even the apple itself had a rise in insulin. Now, this figure shows the rise in glucose going from 70 to 90 milligrams per deciliter after having the apple or applesauce. It's very interesting. Again, it's a paradigm view difference. I look at this graph and say it's all bad, when he's saying that the apple is less bad than, the apple has less of an increase, so it's therefore better. When I look at all of it and I say, from my perspective, it's all bad. You don't want that glucose elevation and you don't want that insulin elevation, because when the glucose goes up, the body doesn't like that. It sends out insulin to lower the glucose. We're trying to protect against that in the dietary pattern that you're eating.
Up, blood glucose goes up, but because there is a higher amount of insulin that is secreted to meet that increased amount of sugar, the actual sugar itself goes up to about the same amount. However, because there is more insulin, because it lasts longer, notice that the apple juice causes hypoglycemia in those situations, even down to as far as 45 to 50, which is pretty low. Now,
so what he's showing is called the insulin overshoot. So that if it's actually the sugary apple juice causing that insulin rise that causes the low blood sugar, because a little too much insulin was secreted. So the blood sugar had an overshoot or undershoot, if you will, overshoot in the insulin, undershoot of the glucose. So you might have reactive hypoglycemia, meaning it's actually the sugar that you drank that causes the low blood sugar. And it's hard for you to know that, because when you drink sugar, you get out of the low blood sugar, but it was actually the sugar that got you there in the first place. So it's fascinating that yes, applesauce, whole apple, and apple juice are equally bad, and yet he's explaining that they're different and one's not as bad. It's a different paradigm.
This is going to cause issues in the human body. The body does not like to have glucose go that low. You can imagine that if this were to happen over and over again from drinking apple juice or soda or things of that nature, the body is going to put into plan ways of preventing this hypoglycemic episode. And one of those ways of doing that is insulin resistance. Notice with the applesauce and the whole apple, you do not get hypoglycemia. And so compensatory mechanisms like insulin resistance is not necessary. We're talking about exactly the same amount of fructose. However, when there is fiber that is surrounding the fructose and perhaps interacting in a way that it gets absorbed more slowly, that can have a very different effect than if we don't have that happening, for instance, in the juice. And that can be seen in this study that was published in 2008 in Diabetes Care, titled Intake of Fruit, Vegetables, and Fruit Juices and the Risk of Diabetes in Women. This was 71,000 nurses, so this is a very homogeneous population, and it was followed for 18 years from 1984. None of them started out with diabetes type 2 or cardiovascular disease. Eventually, after those 18 years, they diagnosed about 4,500 cases of diabetes, which was an incidence of about 7.4%. So what did they find? When they looked at an increase in 3 servings per day in total fruit and vegetable consumption, they did not notice a difference in diabetes incidence. Notice here that this range, this 95% confidence interval, is including 1, and so there was no change. However, when they looked at whole fruit consumption, that was associated with a lower hazard of diabetes. Notice here that there was an 18% reduction, and that was statistically significant. Notice also that an increase in 1 serving per day in green leafy vegetable consumption was also associated with a reduction in diabetes. This was a 9% reduction. However, notice that fruit juice intake, that means no fiber, that means that all the cells were cracked open, that it was basically a bolus of sugar all at the same time. It was associated with an increased hazard of diabetes, and that was an 18% increase, and that was statistically significant. So again, notice the conclusion of this study, that consumption of green leafy vegetables and fruit was associated with a lower hazard of diabetes, whereas consumption of fruit juices may be associated with an increased hazard among women.
So this study is a lot more complicated than I can, it being an association kind of study, and these risks, the hazard ratios are so small, they really are not what we say clinically relevant. But at the same time, I don't think anyone should be having diabetes. So this population is eating a lot of carbohydrate, and you can actually reverse and prevent diabetes by not eating the carbohydrates. So again, it's a different paradigm view, or in this case, it's apples and oranges, apples and applesauce, apples and apple juice. No, I don't want you to have any of those, or a very, very small amount. And what he was talking about with the blood sugar elevation is they all raise the blood sugar. I don't want you to have any of those. So it is as if we're comparing way different situations. They're really not comparable.
Again, we're consuming fruit and fruit juices, and notice that they have a very different effect, even though we're talking about the...
And I think the effect is very much the same. They both raise the blood sugar. But just to be precise, it's sucrose that's in here, and sucrose is fructose and glucose combined. It's interesting how people talk about fruit and it's just fruit and fructose. No, it's sucrose that we're talking about.
Very same substance itself. So how the substance is packaged is just as important in understanding that that substance is there.
And I disagree. Even if it was packaged, it was too high a rise in the blood sugar for me to tolerate, to advise for you to do. So again, it's a different paradigm view. If you're eating lots of carbs, it might be less harmful to have fruit in a fiber, real fruit than fruit juice. But if you're trying to be keto or lower your carbs, you don't want to go near these or restrict to a very small amount, if at all.
It's there. And so I could say that fructose does not always equal fructose. There are other factors that are involved in terms of the effect on the human body.
So stepping back, there are those who, I know the old saying is the PhDs argue how many angels can stand on the head of a pin. Think about things that are not very clinically relevant. Again, my approach is to teach using real foods, to simplify where we can, to make it easier. And I'm finding that the easier you learn the system, the easier the system you learn, the more sustainable that it is over time. So as you're learning something, you don't want to get into something that's a complicated mess. You don't want to have to use apps and food journals and measure ketones and all those ways of doing it. There are a lot of ways to do keto, and the method that I teach is a rather simple one. And it's not a low-carb fruit fallacy. It's just a different paradigm of looking at it. And I would say that those effects on the blood sugar and the insulin, even though they're a little different, they're both too high, and you don't want to go there when you're at least starting on a low-carb keto diet or trying to get back regrouping or rebooting a keto type of diet. I hope that's helpful. Let me know in the comments below, and if you like this, like it, ring the notifications, subscribe. Why not send to a friend? It's a grassroots effort after all. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.